Okay, so today in class you explored quadrilaterals, and hopefully you learned some things about parallelograms, rectangle, rhombus, and a square, and we're just going to, in this video, just go over the actual properties that you need to know. So first of all, you need to know what a quadrilateral is. A quadrilateral is just a shape that has four sides, and you should also know that the sum of the angles is 360 degrees, which means it doesn't matter what the quadrilateral looks like. These all have four sides. All four angles in each one of these quadrilaterals is equal to 360 degrees. So now let's talk about parallelograms and what you need to know about parallelograms. So the first thing that you need to know about parallelograms is that opposite sides are parallel. So here's a parallelogram, and the opposite sides are parallel. So first of all, I'm using arrows to let you know that they're parallel. So that means the two sides should be parallel, and the top and bottom should be parallel. And I'm using single arrows for the sides and then double arrows for the top and bottom to let you know that they are parallel but not parallel to each other. The next thing you need to know is that opposite sides are congruent. So what this means is that the top and bottom would be the same measurement and the two sides would be the same measurement. And this time I'm using hash marks. So these that have single hash marks would be the same measurement, and then the two sides that have the same hash marks would be the same measurement. Opposite angles are congruent. So angles that are across from each other, like this bottom left angle and the top right angle, those two angles should have the same measurement if it's a parallelogram. And then the same thing with the other two angles. Those should also be the same measurement, but they should not be, all four of them should not be equal to each other. And that's why I'm using different types of hash marks. The last thing you should know is that the diagonals bisect each other. So I'm drawing here's a separate parallelogram. I've added the diagonals in, and that the diagonals bisect each other means there's a short diagonal, and then there's this longer diagonal. The short diagonal is broken into two smaller pieces, and those would be congruent to each other. And then the same thing for the longer diagonal. Those two pieces are congruent. And then the last thing you should know is that the sum of the angles is 360 degrees. So the four original angles in the parallelogram will add up to 360 degrees. Next is a rectangle. So first of all of the rules that we just talked about for a parallelogram apply. These sides, the top and bottom, are going to be congruent and parallel. And then the sides will also be congruent and parallel. A rectangle has a couple other properties that are different than a parallelogram, and the first one is that all four angles are congruent, which means, because it's a rectangle, that all four angles are going to be 90 degrees. So to let you know that it's 90 degrees, we draw a little box in each corner to let you know that those are equal to 90 degrees. And then the other rule you need to know about a rectangle is that the diagonals are congruent. So again, here's another rectangle. I've added the diagonals. So the diagonals are congruent means from one corner all the way to the other corner is the same distance as the opposite corners. And so because they're congruent, and if we use the rule that these diagonals bisect each other, for a rectangle, all four of those smaller pieces of the diagonals will be congruent. Next is a rhombus. So for a rhombus, again, all the rules for a parallelogram apply, but the rules for a rectangle do not apply to the rhombus. The extra things for a rhombus is that all four sides are congruent. So this time, all four of those will be the same exact measurement. We're still going to have opposite sides or opposite angles that are congruent, and we're still going to have parallels. We're still going to have parallel sides. And then the other thing you need to know about the rhombus is a couple rules about the diagonals. So here's our diagonals drawn into the rhombus. So the diagonals are perpendicular. So if we go back to And you can kind of tell when they intersect right here at this point, it looks kind of like you actually do have 4 right angles, and that is true. Each one of these angles is 90 degrees. And then the other thing you need to know about the diagonals is that they bisect the angles. So these 4 smaller angles that are all across from each other would be the same measurement. And then these 4 angles that are all across from each other in the rhombus will also be congruent. The last shape is a square. A square uses all the properties from a parallelogram, a rectangle, and a rhombus. And so when we put those properties together, it makes a square kind of unique. So the things that you should know about a square is, first of all, it has opposite sides are parallel. It's going to have 4 right angles, which come from the rectangle. It's going to have 4 congruent sides, which come from the rhombus. And then when we look at the diagonals bisect each other. That comes from a parallelogram. They're going to be congruent to each other. They're going to be the same exact length, which means all 4 of these little pieces will be exactly the same measurement, and that comes from a rhombus. That comes from the rectangle, The 4 congruent pieces of the diagonal come from the rectangle. And then the diagonals are perpendicular. That means they make right angles. That's from the rhombus. And then because we have 4 right angles from the rectangle and the diagonals bisect each one of these angles, each one of these angles, all 8 of them, are going to be exactly the same length. And in class tomorrow, you are going to need to tell me what each of those measurements are. You should be able to figure that out. So I hope you have a good list now of the rules that you need to know for quadrilaterals, and we will go over that list tomorrow in class. See you then.